Over the past year, I've worked with a number of individuals who have been deeply wounded by counselors, pastors, and lay leaders who have not maintained good or clear boundaries when they're functioning in a counseling relationship. Now, licensed counselors have more professional guidelines that they're required to adhere to. Many church-based counselors, as well as lay counselors, need a little bit more help to understand why boundaries are not only important, but actually act as a safety net for you as well as the person you're trying to help. And so let me share with you in this video 3 areas where lay counselors and pastors get into the most trouble. The first one is around informed consent and issues around confidentiality. Now, a licensed counselor is required to inform his or her client before that client ever opens her mouth the rules of confidentiality and what would constitute a breach of confidentiality. Now, this is important because most clients assume that everything they tell you is confidential, but that's not true. For example, if a counselor came for help with a parenting problem and disclosed that in moments of extreme anger, she abused her child, as a licensed professional, I would be required to report her to Child Protective Services. A pastor would too. Now, if my client didn't know my limitations of confidentiality ahead of time, things in the counseling relationship could get very messy because she would have assumed that what she told me was totally confidential when it wasn't. And so before you ever have a counseling conversation with a client or a potential client, whether you're licensed or just a lay counselor or pastoral counselor, usually the paperwork that gets filled out ahead of time, in that you must disclose the limitations of confidentiality, which your client needs to read, agree to, and sign. Now, for a licensed professional, those limits if a client discloses intent to harm themselves or harm another person or has abused a child, then confidentiality is broken. In addition, if you're a licensed counselor, you're not allowed to discuss anything about your client with anyone else, including a family member, without the client's written consent. And that means if his or her spouse or pastor or concerned relative calls you, you as his counselor are not allowed to discuss any information about your client, not even whether that are your client or have attended any counseling sessions with you. Also, if your client uses medical insurance for reimbursement for fees charged, it's in your client's best interest for you to disclose what diagnosis you've put on his or her medical record, because that information becomes a part of your client's permanent medical record, which can have a long-term implication for later acquiring life insurance, for example, or even for adopting a child. Informed consent means you give your client a choice as to whether or not he or she wants to use their insurance if the given diagnosis may restrict future opportunities. Now, if you're a church counselor or non-licensed professional, you're not governed by the same state licensing rules, but that does not mean you should not have your own guidelines on confidentiality to ensure you and your counselee's well-being. The person you see will want to know everything she says to you is totally confidential, and if not, what are the exceptions? It would be wise to think about these things ahead of time and have your guidelines in place as a church so that you're consistent and can let your counseling know what he or she can expect from you. They may also want to know where you keep your written notes of the sessions. And who else has access to read those records, especially if you're in a church setting? Are they in a locked file? If not, they should be. You should also let your counseling know what your policy is if someone from their family or someone else in the church contacts you in order to talk about your work with them. Can they trust you not to talk about them without their written consent? Your counselee will feel much safer having these consents and confidentiality guidelines in writing so that there is no misunderstanding. The second area counselors often get into trouble is with relationship boundaries. Now, if you're a licensed counselor, you already know that you're not allowed to engage in personal relationships with someone you are professionally helping, even after the counseling relationship is over. What that means is that you as a counselor are not supposed to go to lunch with your client or get together on the weekend for a movie or attend an open house holiday party or even accept expensive gifts from one of your clients. If you're licensed, counseling is considered a professional relationship and needs to be protected. Now, an exception might be made to maybe attend a funeral if a client had someone close that passed away suddenly, or maybe if you were instrumental in premarital work or restoring a broken marriage, you might attend a client's wedding or a recommitment of vows ceremony, but usually not even attending the reception. This strong boundary sometimes shocks and hurts our clients because the relationship they build with us often starts to feel like a close friendship, and it hurts their feelings when we have to say no to their personal invitations or their gifts. But your client only has one counselor, and they can have lots of friends. And part of good counseling is helping them build other supportive relationships. Protecting the counseling relationship also means that the counselor is very clear at what times the counselor comes to the office and how long each session will be. And payment information, if it's involved, is spelled out ahead of time, and the ways and methods of contacting you are understood. For example, you may not want your client to email you or text you or use your social media to connect. You don't want to be their friend on Facebook. This is to keep the relationship from sliding into a more personal relationship. And as the counselor, you're the one responsible for setting and maintaining these professional boundaries. In addition, you should also let your counseling know how you want to be contacted in an emergency and when he or she can expect you to respond within 24 hours, right away, how long. On my informed consent sheet with the counseling client, I would spell out what they could expect from me if we even ran into each other at a church setting or even in the grocery store. This was important for confidentiality purposes because I didn't want her child or her husband or friend saying, well, how do you know Leslie Vernick? Or even getting hurt because I didn't acknowledge that I knew them at church. So I put it in writing. I will not approach or acknowledge you if we see each other in settings other than the office in order to protect your confidentiality. With email and internet use so common, the rules of engagement between counselor and counselee are being reevaluated by licensing boards. And it isn't always so black and white, but the main point is to keep clear on the communication is professional and not personal. Now, if you're a non-licensed counselor or a lay counselor, the rules and boundaries are not so clear because you may attend the same church, your kids may be friends, perhaps you're in a small group together, and I don't always think this is a bad thing, but it does make counseling murkier and messier. There are many one another passages in the Bible that tell us that we are to come alongside one another when we're suffering or in pain, and this may be for a moment or even for a season. One friend might counsel another, and this is a good thing, but understand that the boundaries are not as clear-cut or spelled out and may become confusing to your friend who's now also becoming your counselee. And it may be helpful just to set up some temporary boundaries to protect both you and your friend who's now becoming your counselee. For example, will you have regular times to meet? And if so, where will you meet? Can she call you whenever she needs to? She might be able to do it as a friend, but in a counseling relationship, you might need to have some boundaries around that. Like how often? What are the time limits? Should she call you on her cell phone versus home phone versus office phone? How about on the weekend? How about email? Can she email you whenever she needs to? And if so, what email address should she use? And if you're in a small group together, or you have social contacts, mutual friends, talk about how this will be handled and how confidentiality will be maintained. The third area counselors get into lots of trouble is touching boundaries. Now, human touch is very important. And as a counselor, pastor, lay leader, small group leader, we have to be wise because we're people and we feel deep care and compassion for those we're helping, especially when we see they're hurting. And we often just want to reach out and hug them or hold their hand or put our arm around them. But a counselor should never do this without asking for their counselee's permission and being extremely cautious about any hint of sexual touch. Sexual relationships of any kind are prohibited between a counselor that's licensed and a counselee, even if both of you give consent. And if this happens, a licensed counselor will lose his or her license to practice their profession. This is prohibited even after the counseling relationship has ended. Now, if you're not licensed, please don't abuse the trust that your counselee has put in you by not holding clear and firm boundaries. If your own feelings or his or hers are becoming more personal, it is your responsibility to maintain those healthy and biblical boundaries, which include no sexual contact. When you work closely with a person, it's not uncommon for him or her to develop strong feelings and even be sexually attracted to you. Perhaps for the first time she feels cared for, validated, listened to, and heard. And in her confusion, she may flirt with you. She may be seductive or even feel like she's falling in love with you. In her mind, the relationship is becoming personal and mutual. It is not, or it should not. And you as the counselor, whether you're a licensed counselor or a non-licensed counselor, must maintain that boundary. You can reassure your client that her feelings are not uncommon and they will pass. It is your job to remind her that your relationship together right now is professional, and if you're licensed, it must always stay that way. She may be disappointed, but she will feel safer and actually relieved. Now, if you're a pastor or male counselor, it's very important that you are exceedingly aware of yourself, because seeing a damsel in distress, especially when she's attractive and flirtatious, can be a huge turn-on for you. even if you're a counselor or pastor. It pulls at your hero strings. You sort of want to rescue her from her awful marriage. You want to help her feel loved for the first time in her life. And sometimes you might be tempted to lie to yourself, telling yourself that God has given you some special permission to cross the professional boundary line in order to help her in a special way that no one else can. Sounds weird. Believe me, I've seen it happen too many times, and trust me, it never, ever ends well. The counselor, whether you're a lay counselor or a licensed counselor, is always 100% responsible to hold to the boundary of absolutely no sexual contact, period. There is so much to learn in order for you to be an effective and safe people helper. And so if you're having trouble of any kind with these 3 areas, please make sure you get some professional consultation and accountability so that you do no harm to those God has entrusted into your care. I'd also highly encourage you to check out a training group that I offer called Equip. It's for those individuals who want to be better equipped for dealing wisely and competently with those in abusive and destructive relationships. You can find more information about Equip on my free resource page. So leave your comment below with any questions you have, and I look forward to seeing you and talking with you soon. Take care and God bless.